This is Book 4 of the Voyage of the Argo by Apollonius of Rhodes. Now once again I do apologize in advance for my pronunciation of these Greek names. Book 4, Homeward Bound. Now tell us, Muse, in your own heavenly tongue, how the Colchian maiden schemed and suffered. Speak, daughter of Zeus, for here your poet falters, and the words fail to come. What drove her to desert her home? Was it the frenzy of a star-crossed love, or must we call it panic? All night Aeetes sat in his palace with his Colchian noblemen, planning a treacherous stroke against the Argonauts. He was consumed with rage at the lamentable outcome of the test, and by no means satisfied that his daughters had not a hand in the affair. Meanwhile, the goddess Hera filled Medea's heart with agonizing fears. She trembled like a slender fawn caught in the woodland thicket and terrified by the baying hounds. She realized at once that her father could not fail to know what she had done for Jason, and that she would soon be called on to pay the price in full. She also feared the maids who had seen something of their secret meeting. Her eyes burnt, and there was a fearful roaring in her ears. Often, in her acute distress, she groaned and clutched her throat. She tore her hair. Indeed, she would have taken poison then and there and died before her time, frustrating the designs of Hera, had not the goddess put it in her troubled mind that she might flee with Phrixus' sons. This thought stilled her fluttering heart, and fortitude returned. She cleared her lap of deadly drugs and poured them all back into the box. She kissed her bed. She kissed her posts on either side of the folding doors. She stroked the walls of her room, then, tearing off one of her long tresses, she left it there for her mother in memory of her girlhood, and said her sad goodbye. Mother, I go, leaving this lock here in my stead. Farewell, for I am going far away. Farewell, Chalciope, farewell, my home and all it holds. O Jason, you should never have come here. I wished the sea had been the end of you. With that and shedding many tears she went, much as a newly captured girl, torn from her own land by the fortune of war, makes off from the rich house before she is inured to work and schooled in the miseries of servitude under the cruel eye of a mistress. The slave girl slinks away, but the beautiful Medea sped through the palace, and for her the very doors responding to her hasty incantation swung open of their own accord. She ran barefoot down narrow alleys, holding her mantle over her forehead with her left hand to hide her face, and with the other lifting up the hem of her skirt. Swiftly and fearfully she passed across the great city by a secret way, and so beyond the walls, unrecognized by any of the watch, who had not even seen her in her flight. From there she meant to reach the temple. She knew the road well enough, having often roamed in that direction, searching for corpses or for noxious roots, as witches do. But none the less she was afraid and trembled in fear. Rising from the distant east, Lady Moon, Titanian goddess, saw the girl wandering distraught, and in wicked glee said to herself, "So I am not the only one to go astray for love, I that burn for beautiful Endymion, and seek him in the Latmian cave. How many times when I was bent on love have you disrobed me with your incantations, making the night moonless so that you might practice your beloved witchcraft undisturbed. And now you are as lovesick as myself. The little god of mischief has given you Jason and many heartache with him. Well, go your way, but clever as you are, steel yourself now to face a life of sighs and misery. So said the moon, but Medea in her haste sped on, and presently, to her relief, found herself on the high bank of the river, and looking across it caught the gleam of a bonfire which the Argonauts kept blazing all night in celebration of their triumph. She sent a clear call ringing through the dark to Phrontis, youngest son of Phrixus, on the other bank. He and his brothers, as well as Jason, recognized her voice and told the rest, who were speechless with amazement when they realized the truth. Medea called 3 times. 3 times at the bidding of the others Phrontis shouted back, and all the while they were rowing eagerly towards her. Even before they made fast to the opposite bank, Jason leapt lightly to the ground from Argo's deck. He was followed by Phrontis and Argos, the sons of Phrixus, and at once Medea's arms were round their knees, and she was making her appeal. My dear ones, save me from Aeetes, save yourselves, all is discovered, all, and there is nothing we can do. Let us sail away before that man can even mount his chariot, and I myself will give you the golden fleece, putting the guardian snake to sleep. But you, Jason, in the presence of your men, must call the gods to witness the vows that you have made me. Do not expose me to insult and disgrace when I have left my country far away and have no kinsman to protect me. She spoke in anguish and fell at Jason's feet. But what she said had warmed his heart. At once he raised her tenderly and embraced her. Then, to comfort her, he said, Dear lady, I swear, and may Olympian Zeus and his consort Hera, goddess of wedlock, be my witness, that when we are back in Hellas, I will take you into my home as my own wedded wife. And with that he took her right hand in his own. Medea urged them to row with all speed to the sacred wood, so that while it was still dark they might seize and carry off the fleece in defiance of their king. This was no sooner said than done. They took her on board at once, thrust Argo from the bank and rowed off, waking the night as they struck the water with their pine wood blades. It was then that Medea had a wild moment of regret. She started to go back, stretching her hands out to the shore, but Jason went to her, reassuring her with words, and checked her desperate design. He and Medea reached their goal at that late hour of night when the hunter, cutting short his sleep, sallies with his trusty hound before the glaring light of dawn can mar the quarry's trail and spoil the scent. They landed on a lawn called the Ram's Bed, as it was there the ram that carried minion Phrixus on his back first flexed his weary knees. Nearby, begrimed with smoke, was the base of the altar that Phrixus has set up for Zeus, the friend of fugitives, when he sacrificed the golden wonder, as Hermes had bidden him to do when he met him on the way. Here then, under Argus's direction, the crew set the pair ashore. A path led them back to the sacred wood, where they were making for a huge oak on which the fleece was hung, bright as a cloud, incarnadined with the fiery beams of the rising sun. But the serpent with his sharp, unsleeping eyes had seen them coming and now confronted them, stretching out his long neck and hissing terribly. The high banks of the river and the deep recesses of the wood threw back the sound, and far away from the Titanian air it reached the ears of the Colchians living by the outfall of Lycus, the river that parts from the loud waters of Araxes, to unite his sacred stream with that of Phasis, and flow in company with him till both debouch into the Caucasian Sea. Babies sleeping in their mothers' arms were startled by the hiss, and their anxious mothers, waking in alarm, hugged them closer to their breasts. The monster in his sheath of horny scales rolled forward his interminable coils, like the eddies of black smoke that spring from smouldering logs and chase each other from below in endless convolutions. But as he writhed, he saw the maiden take her stand and heard her sweet voice invoking sleep, the conqueror of the gods, to charm him. She also called on the night-wandering queen of the world below to countenance her efforts. Jason from behind looked on in terror, but the giant snake, enchanted by her song, was soon relaxing the whole length of his serrated spine and smoothing out his multitudinous undulations, like a dark, silent swell rolling across the sluggish sea. Yet his grim head still hovered over them, and the cruel jaws threatened to snap them up. But Medea, chanting a spell, dripped a fresh spig of juniper in her brew and sprinkled his eyes with the most potent drug. And as the all-pervading magic scent spread round his head, sleep fell upon him. Stirring no more, he let his jaw sink to the ground, and his innumerable coils lay stretched out far behind, spanning the deep wood. Medea called to Jason, and he snatched the golden fleece from the oak, but she herself stayed where she was, smearing the wild one's head with the magic salve, till Jason urged her to come back to the ship, and she left the sombre grove of Ares. Lord Jason held up the great fleece in his arms. The shimmering wool threw a fiery glow on his fair cheeks and forehead, and he rejoiced in it, glad as a girl who catches on her silken gown the lovely light of the full moon as it climbs in the sky and looks into her attic room. The ram's skin with its golden covering was as large as the hide of the yearling heifer or a brocket, as a young stag is called by hunting folk. The long flocks weighed it down, and the very ground before him as he walked was bright with gold. When he slung it on his left arm shoulder, as he did at times, it reached his feet. But now and again he made a bundle of it in his arms. He was mortally afraid that some god or man might rob him on the way. Dawn was spreading over the world when they rejoined the rest. The young men marvelled when they saw the mighty fleece, dazzling as the lightning of Zeus. And they all leapt up in eagerness to touch it and hold it in their hands. But Jason kept them off and threw a new mantle over the fleece. Then he led Medea aft, found her a seat, and addressed his men. "My friends," he said, "let us start for home without delay. The prize for which we dared greatly and suffered misery on the cruel sea is ours. And the task proved easy thanks to this lady whom I intend, with her consent, to bring home with me and wed. You too must cherish her. She is the true saviour of Archaea and yourselves. I spoke of haste, for I am sure that Aeetes and his mob are on their way to bar our passage from the river to the sea. So man the ship, man every bench, 2 men on each, taking it in turns to row. That will leave half of you to hold aloft your ox-hide shields against the arrows of the enemy and protect us as we get away. Remember, we hold the future in our children and our dear country and our aged parents in our hands. Hellas depends on us. We can plunge her in grief. We can bring her glory. With that, he donned his arms. The eager crew responded with a great shout, and Jason, drawing his sword, cut through the horses at the stern. Then, in his battle gear, he took his stand beside Medea, and the steersman Anchias and Argo leapt forward to the oars, as the crew strained every nerve to bring her clear of the river. By now the haughty king and all his Colchians were well aware of Medea's love for Jason and the part she had played. In full armour they gathered in the market-place, countless as the waves of the sea whipped up by a winter storm, or the leaves that fall to earth in autumn from the myriad branches of the trees. And who can number them? So, in their multitudes they streamed along the banks of the river in full cry. Aeetes, in his fine chariot with the wind-swift horses that Helios had given him, stood out above them all. In his left hand he held a round shield, in the other a long torch of pine wood, and his huge spear lay beside him, pointing to the front. Asphorates held the reins. But the ship swept down the broad stream by the current, and the strong men at the oars was already standing out to sea. It was a bitter moment for Aeetes. In a frenzy he lifted up his hands to Helios and Zeus, calling on them to witness these outrageous deeds. And on the spot he threatened his whole people with dire pains if they should fail to lay their hands on his daughter. Whether they found her on land or caught the ship while still on the high seas, they must bring her to him, so that he might satisfy his lust for revenge, exacting payment for all that had been done. If not, they should experience in themselves the full force of his wrath and the weight of his avenging hand, paying with their own lives. Thus the king thundered, and on the self-same day the Colchians launched their ships, equipped them, and put out. One might have taken their immense armada for an endless flight of birds, flock after flock, breaking the silence of the sea. Meanwhile there was a fresh breeze for the Argonauts. Hera had seen to it. She wished Medea to reach the Pelasgian land, bringing doom on the house of Peleus as quickly as might be. And in the morning of the 3rd day they made fast their stern cables on the Paphlagonian coast at the mouth of the river Halys. Medea had told them to land there and propitiate Hecate with sacrifice, but with what ritual she prepared the offering no one must hear, nor must I let myself be tempted to describe it. My lips are sealed by awe. But the altar they built for the goddess on the beach is still there for men of later age to see. At this point it was natural for Jason and all his friends to think of Phineus, and how he had told them they would return from Aea by a different route. But nobody knew exactly what the seer had meant, and they listened eagerly to all that Argus had to tell them. He said, We are going to Orochmis. The prophet whom you met made that your destination, and he never errs. There is indeed another route. Priests of the gods who arose in Egyptian Thebes have made this clear. Think of a time when the wheeling constellations did not yet exist, when one would have looked in vain for the sacred Danaan race, finding only the Aphidnaean Arcadians, who are said to have lived before the moon itself was there, feeding on acorns in the hills. These were the days before the noble scions of Deucalion ruled the Pelagessian land, when Egypt, mother of an earlier race, was known as the corn-rich country of the dawn, and the Nile, the waters, all its length was called Triton, a generous river flowing through the rainless land, yet by its floods producing crops in plenty. Now we are told that from this country a certain king set out, supported by a strong and loyal force, and made his way through the whole of Europe and Asia, founding many cities as he went. Some of these survive, though others have succumbed to the burden of years. But to this day Aea stands, with people in it descended from the very men whom that king settled there. Moreover, they have preserved tablets of stone which their ancestors engraved with maps giving the outlines of the land and sea and the routes in all direction. On these is shown a river, the farthest branch of ocean stream, broad and deep enough to carry merchantmen. They placed it at a great distance from Aea, giving it the name Istar. Far away beyond the north wind, its headwaters come rushing down from the Riphaean mountains. Then it flows for a time through endless plains as a single stream. But when it reaches the borderlands of Thrace and Scythia, it divides, one branch running into the Ionian Sea and the other flowing south into the gulf that stretches from the Sicilian Sea, a sea that washes your own shores, if I am right in thinking that the river Archelius flows into it from Hellas. Argus finished, and the goddess gave her blessing to the route he had proposed by sending them a sign. With cries of joy they saw overhead a trail of heavenly light, showing them the way to go. So they left the sons of Lycus there, and with all their canvas spread sailed happily away. They sighted the Paphlagonian mountains, but did not round Carambes, for the wind held and the celestial fire glowed in their van till they reached the mighty river Istar. Now some of the Colchians on a false trail had passed out of the Black Sea between the Chinean rocks. The rest, with Amphitrite in command, made for the Istar and turned into the river by the fair mouth, gaining access to this, the farthest inlet of the Ionian Sea, by doubling a narrow neck of land. Thus they outstripped the Argonauts, for here the Istar embraces an island called Peuce, shaped like a triangle, the base presenting beaches to the sea and the apex pointing up the river, which is thus divided into two channels, one known as the Narex and the other at the lower end of the island is the fair mouth. It was by the fair mouth that Apistris and his Colchians sailed with all speed into the river, whereas the Argonauts went a long way up the coast to the upper end of the island. The Colchian vessels spread panic as they went, Shepherds grazing their flocks in the meadows by the river abandoned their sheep at the terrifying sight, taking the ships for live monsters that had come up from the sea, the mother of the Leviathans. For none of the Istrian tribes, the Thracians and the Scythian friends of Sigyn, the Grausini and the Sindi, who had already occupied the great empty plain of Laurianum, none of these had ever set eyes on a sea-going vessel. In due course the Colchian fleet reached Mount Angurus, and came at last, when they had left the mountain and the Laurian plain behind them, to the rock of Colicus, where Ista is divided into two branches and so descends into the widely separated seas. The Colchians sailed down the Illyrian branch into the Cronean Sea, and once there blocked every exit to prevent the quarry from slipping through their hands. Meanwhile, the Argonauts, who had followed them down the same river, reached the two Phrygian islands which lie near the coast. These are sacred to Artemis, who had a temple on one of them, and they sought refuge from the forces of Aspretus on the other, knowing that their enemies, whatever they had done with the many other islands at the river mouth, had left these two strictly alone in deference to the daughter of Zeus. But the rest were crowded with the Colchians and barred every outlet to the open sea. In fact, Ipsritus had posted men on each of the neighbouring isles right up to the river Salangon and to the Nestian shore. If Menei, outnumbered as they were, had fought it out at this point, they would have met with disaster, but they evaded a pitched battle by coming to terms with the enemy. It was decided that the Golden Fleece, since Aeetes himself had said they should have it if they accomplished their allotted task, was theirs by right, and they could keep it, whether they had acquired it by clandestine means or openly defied the king and helped themselves. As for Medea, and here was the bone of contention, they would place her in chancery with the gold goddess Artemis and leave her there, till one of the kings entitled to mete out justice and should decide whether she was to go home to her father or follow the Argonauts to Hellas. When Medea realized all that was involved in the terms of this treaty, she was appalled and could not rest till she had spoken to Jason in private. So she beckoned him to leave his friends, and when she had brought him far enough away, she forced him and broke into passionate protestations. "My lord, what is this plan that you and my brother are making for my disposal? Has your splendid success destroyed your memory? Have you forgotten all that you said to me when you were forced to seek my help? Where are the oaths you swore by Zeus, the suppliant's god? Where are the honeyed promises that I believed in when I defied convention and my own conscience, abandoning my country, the glories of my home, even my parents, everything I valued most? And now I am carried off far away across the sea with only the wistful Halcyons for company. All this was as I saw you through your troubles, saw that you won your battle with the bulls and giants and came out alive, and then the fleece for which you crossed the sea, you got it through my own folly. I have disgraced my sex. And so I say that I am yours, your daughter, wife, and sister, and I follow you to Hellas. You should be ready to stand by me, come what may. instead of leaving me alone while you consult with kings? Why not run off with me? And no more said. You and I, in law and honour, pledge to one another. Abide by that, or else draw your sword and slit my throat, and let me make amends to you for my infatuation. Think of my misery if the king to whom you both refer this infamous agreement hands me over to my brother. How am I to look my father in the face as an honest woman? I can scarcely imagine the cruelty of his revenge, the tortures I should suffer for my crimes. And you, do you look forward to a happy homecoming? I hope that Hera, Queen of Heaven, whose favourite you claim to be, will never let you have it. I hope that you will think of me some day when you yourself are suffering. I hope the fleece will vanish like an idle dream down into Erebus. And may my avenging furies chase you from your home, and so repay me for all I have endured through your inhumanity. You have broken a most solemn oath. It is not in reason that my curses should miscarry. You are inflexible. But wait a while. You and your friends think that this covenant has solved your problems, and I am nothing in your eyes. You will learn better soon. She boiled with rage. She longed to set the ship on fire and break it and hurl herself into the flames. But Jason calmed her. She had frightened them. He said, "Enough, my lady. I am no happier about this business than you are. But we are seeking to stave off a fight, encircled as we are by vast hordes of enemies, and all your account. Even the natives here are ready to take up arms for Asperitas, wishing to see you led back to your father like some captured girl. And if we faced him in the field, we should, every one of us, be slaughtered. Would it not mortify you even more if we were killed and left you to them as a prize? However, this truce will leave us free to plan a pitfall for Asperitas, and I cannot think that the natives would attack us for your sake to oblige the Colchians. If the Colchian commander, who is your brother and protector, were removed. As for his troops, I shall not hesitate to engage them if they refuse to let me through." He was trying to placate her. There was death in her reply. "Plan now," she said. "Evil deeds commit us to expedience, evil as the deeds themselves. It was I who took the first false step, blinded as I was, and driven by the powers that be to go to my wicked way. If you will hold the Colchian spearmen off, I for my part will lure Asperitas into your hands. But you must keep him friendly. Offer him splendid gifts when his heralds are taking them away. I hope to persuade them to arrange a secret conference between myself and him. Then, if you have the stomach for the deed, kill him. I shall not blame you, and make war on the Colchians." So they agreed and set about the preparation of the fatal trap. Gifts for Asperitas were laid out in plenty, the kind of gifts that host and guests exchange. They even added to their number a sacred garment that had belonged to Hypsipyle. It was a purple robe, which the divine graces had made with their own hands for Dionysus in sea-girt Dia. Later Dionysus gave it to his son Thoas. Thoas left it to Hypsipyle, and she, with another piece of finery, gave it to Jason as a parting gift. It was a work of art, a joy forever, as pleasing to the eye as to the sense of touch. And it still gave out the ambrosial perfume it received when Lord Dionysus lay on it, tipsy with wine and nectar, embracing Minos' daughter, the fair young Ariadne, who Theseus carried off from Knossos and abandoned on the Isle of Dia. Medea gave the heralds a missive for Aphrystus that would serve as bait. As soon as she had come to the temple of Artemis in accordance with the treaty, he was to meet her there under the cover of night. She was planning to steal the golden fleece and return with him to the palace of Aeetes. They must confer. And, as a pretext for her treachery, she said that the sons of Phrixus had compelled her to go off with the Argonauts. Such was the law, and she reinforced her words with magic, scattering to the four winds spells of potency, as would have drawn wild creatures far away to come down from their mountain fastnesses. Unconscionable love, bane and tormentor of mankind, parent of strife, fountain of tears, source of 1,000 ills, rise, mighty power, and fall on the sons of our enemies with all the force you used upon Medea when you filled her with intense fury. For Aphrystus did obey her call, and she destroyed him foully. It rests with me to tell the sorry tale. When the two parties, in accordance with their pact, left Medea on the island of Artemis, they ran ashore at separate spots. Jason, going into ambush, waited for Aphrystus, and for his own men, whom he expected later. Presently, Aphrystus himself, tempted by Medea's treacherous offer, came speeding over the sea in his own ship, and landed on the sacred island at dead of night. Unescorted, he went straight up to his sister, and began to sound her in the hope that she would have some plan for turning the tables on her foreign friends. He might have been a little boy trying to ford a winter torrent that a strong man could not cross. However, they agreed on every point, and now Jason leapt from his hiding place with his naked sword uplifted. Medea quickly turned aside, covering her eyes with her veil so as not to see her brother's blood spilt. And Jason marked him down and struck him as the butcher fells a mighty strong-horned bull. The deed was done at the temple of Artemis, which Brigi from the mainland coast had built. Aphrystus sank to his knees in the porch, and in his death throes cupped his hands over the wound to staunch the dark blood. Even so, as Medea shrank aside, he painted red her silvery veil and dress. With eyes askance, unforgiving and indomitable fury took quick note of the heinous deed. But Jason, after lopping off the dead man's extremities, licked up some of the blood 3 times, and 3 times spat the pollution out, as killers do in an attempt to expiate a treacherous murder. Then he hid the cold corpse in the earth, and there the bones lie still among the people who have kept Aphrystus' name alive. By now the rest of the Argonauts were coming up. Medea signalled to them by raising a torch, and as soon as they saw the light, they laid their own ship by the vessel that had brought Aphrystus and slaughtered the Colchian crew, falling on them like hawks on a flock of pigeons, or mountain lions leaping into a sheepfold and bringing havoc to the huddled flock. Not a man escaped death. They swept through the whole crew like a forest fire. Jason joined them, eager to lend a hand, but he came too late. They did not need his help and were already wondering whether he needed theirs. They sat down to plot the future course. This needed careful thought, and they were still debating when Medea joined them. But Peleus was the first to come forward with a plan. "We must embark," he said, "while it is still dark, and row through the passage opposite to that commanded by the enemy. At dawn they will discover what has happened, and I am convinced that after no consideration will induce them to prolong the chase. They will have lost their prince. There will be bitter quarrels that will break them up, and when the forces are dispersed, it should be easy for us to return here and resume our present course." This from the sons of Aeacus, decided the young lords. They embarked at once and rowed with all their might, never pausing until they reached the sacred Isle of Amber, the innermost of all the Amber Islands, at the mouth of Eridanus. Meanwhile the Colchians, when they heard of their prince's death, made ready to pursue the Minyae in Argo, through all the length of the Cronian Sea. Here damped their ardour by means of a terrific thunderstorm, and when instead they thought of going home, no goddess was needed to remind them of Aeetes' savage threats. In the end, deciding that Colchis was no place for them, they split into several groups, which set out in different directions and established settlements. Some landed on the islands that the Argonauts had occupied, and these still live there. They call themselves Asphritians. Others settled down amongst the Encheleans, building a walled town by the deep and dark Illyrian river, where Harmonia and Cadmus were buried. Others again live in the mountains, which are called the Thunderers, in memory of the day when the thunder of Zeus and the son of Kronos deterred them from crossing to the island opposite. When the Argonauts felt that they could safely do so, they left the Isle of Amber to resume their homeward voyage. But they found the sea ahead so cluttered with islets that a ship could scarcely thread her way between them. So they made for the Hylian coast and anchored there. As before, the Hylians showed them no hostility, and of their own accord helped them on their way, for which Jason rewarded them with a large tripod he had had from Apollo. This was one of a pair given to him by Phoebus to serve him on his mission. When they went to holy Pytho to consult the god about the very voyage, Heaven had decreed that the land that held either of these tripods should never be laid waste by an invading force, which is the reason why Jason's gift lies hidden to this day in the Hylian earth, close to their own peaceful town. They buried it deep where nobody could ever find it. Hylas, their king, had died before the Argonauts' arrival. He was the son of the beautiful Melite and Heracles, and was born in Phoenician land. For his father had come to King Nausithous and the Isle of Macris, nurse of Dionysus, to obtain absolution for the murder of his children. There Heracles fell in love with the water nymph Melite, a daughter of river Aegeus, and she bore him the mighty Hylas. By the time Hylas had reached man's estate, he felt that he had lived long enough on the island of his birth under the stern eye of King Nausithous. So he collected a party of native Phaeacians and assisted the king himself, migrated with them to the Cronian Sea, and in those parts he settled and was killed by the Mentors in the course of a cattle raid. Tell me now, muses, how the Argo travelled far beyond the Cronian Sea, leaving in Italy and the Ligurian islands that are called the Stoechades, innumerable chases which have been faithfully recorded. Whose was the hand and what the need that made them stray so far, and what winds carried them? So signal the downfall of Asphytes, that Zeus himself, king of the gods, took umbrage at the horrid deed, and ordained that they should wipe away the guilty stain of blood with the aid of the Aeaean Circe, and suffer endless hardships before they reach their homes. But none of them knew this. Standing out in the Hylaean coast, they ran a long way south, leaving behind them the string of Liburnian islands, and the Colchians had occupied Issa, Cyclades, and beautiful Perea. Next they approached Corsica, where Poseidon found a home far from her native land for Asopus' daughter, Corcyra, and the lovely locks, when in his passion he had made off with her from Phyllis. The dark forests that cover the island give it a sombre look, and passing sailors call it Black Corica. After this, still favoured by a gentle breeze, they passed Melite, steep Cerossus, and out on the horizon Nymphaea, the home of the powerful Calypso, daughter of Atlas. Through the mist they even saw, or thought they saw, the Acrocranian mountains. But now Hera, remembering the wrath of Zeus and the plans that he had for them, contrived to set them on their destined course. She raised a strong head wind which swept them straight back to the rugged Isle of Amber. And as they ran before the gale, there suddenly cried out to them in human speech the talking beam of the Dodanian oak that Athene had fitted in the middle of the Argo stem. The voice announcing as it did the vengeful ire of Zeus brought terror to the crew. It threatened them with endless wanderings across tempestuous seas, till Circe should have purged them of the cruel murder of Asphytes. And it bade Polydeuces and Caspar beg the immortal gods to grant them access to the Italian Sea, where they would find Circe, daughter of Perse, and the sun. Out of the night Argo had spoken, and the twins rose at once and lifted up their hands in prayer to heaven for all its grace. But the rest was sunk in gloom, and Argo sped on under sail up the Eridanus as far as ships can go. They reached the outfall of that deep lake where Pathon struck in the breast, and half consumed by the blazing thunderbolt, fell into the water from the chariot of the sun. His wounded body smoulders to this day and sends up clouds of steam. Even the light-winged birds that try to fly across the water fail to reach the other side, and with a helpless flutter plunge into the heat. All around, the daughters of the sun, encased the tall poplars, utter their sad and unavailing plaint. Shining drops of amber fall from their eyes onto the sands and are dried there by the sun. But when the wailing wind stirs and the dark waters of the lake to rise above the beach, all the tears that have collected there are swept by the overflow into the river. The Celts, however, have another tale about these amber drops that are carried down the current. They say they are the many tears that Apollo shed for his son Asclepius, when he visited the sacred people of the north. He was banished from the bright sky by his father Zeus, whom he blamed for having killed this son of his, who was born by the lady Coronis in splendid Lacaria, at the mouth of the Amris. That is the tale according to the Celts. It was not a place likely to delight the Argonauts. Indeed, they could not even bring themselves to eat or drink. By day they were plagued to the point of exhaustion by the nauseating stench of Phaeton's smouldering body, which the outflow of the river emitted all the time. At night they had to listen to the loud lament of the shrill-voiced daughters of the sun, whose tears were borne along the stream like drops of oil. From this spot they made their way into the Rhone, a deep river which joins the Eridanus, raising a great commotion at the water's meet. It rises at the world's end by the gates and courts of night, and flows on in 3 streams, one of which debouches on the shores of Ocean, another into the Ionian Sea, and the third through 7 mouths into the great gulf of the Sardinian Sea. From the Rhone they passed into the storm-swept lakes that lie across the uncharted country of the Celts, and here they might have run into disaster. One outlet from the lakes led to the Gulf of Ocean, which, in their ignorance, they were about to enter. Had they done so, they would have never got back alive. But they were saved by Hera, who leapt down from heaven and called out to them from the Heraclean rock. Terrified by the cry, which made the broad sky ring again, they turned back in obedience to the goddess and found the way that was to bring them home. Still guided by Hera, they passed through the countless Celtic and Ligurian tribes, coming to no harm as the goddess spread a magic mist around them by day, and so that at last they reached the shore of the sounding sea. Leaving the Rhone by its central mouth, they crossed over to the Stoechades Islands, owing their safety on this occasion to Castor and Polydeuces, which is why these sons of Zeus have ever since been honoured with altars and sacred rites. Though this was not the only voyage where they played a part of saviours. Zeus put the ships of generations then unborn in the keeping of the twins. Leaving the Stoechades, they passed on to the island of Elba. They had toiled hard, and when they landed, they scraped away the sweat with pebbles. Where they did this, skin-coloured pebbles strew the beach. Quoits and marvellous weapons that belong to them are also found on the island, and it has a harbour which bears the name of Argo. Passing swiftly over the Ausonian Sea, with the Tyrrhenian coast in sight, they came to the famous haven of Aea, took Argo close in and tied up to the shore. Here they found Circe bathing her head in the salt water. She had been terrified by a nightmare in which she saw all the rooms and walls of her house streaming with blood, and fire devouring all the magic drugs which she had used to bewitch her visitors. But she managed to put out the red flames with the blood of the murdered man, gathering it up in her hands, and so the horror passed. When the morning came, she rose from bed, and now she was washing her hair and clothes in the sea. A number of creatures whose ill-assorted limbs declared them to be neither man nor beast had gathered around her like a great flock of sheep following their shepherd from the fold. Nondescript monsters such as these fitted the miscellaneous limbs, were once produced spontaneously by the earth out of the primeval mud, when she had not yet solidified under a rainless sky and was deriving no moisture from the blazing sun. But time, combining this with that, brought the animal creation into order. The Argonauts were dumbfounded by the scene, but a glance at Circe's form and eyes convinced them all that she was the sister of Aeetes. As soon as she had dismissed the fears engendered by her dream, Circe set out for home, but as she left she invited the young men to come with her, beckoning them on in her own seductive way. Jason told them to take no notice, and they all stayed where they were, but he himself, bringing Medea with him, followed in Circe's steps till they reached her house. Circe, at a loss to know why they had come, invited them to sit in polished chairs, but without a word they made for the hearth and sat down there, after the manner of suppliants in distress. Medea hid her face in her hands. Jason fixed in the ground the great hilted sword with which he had killed Asphytus, and neither of them looked her in the face, so she knew at once that these were fugitives with murder on their hands, and took the course laid down by Zeus, the god of suppliants, who heartily abhors the killing of a man, and yet as heartily befriends the killer. She set out the rites by which the ruthless slayer is absolved when he seeks asylum at the hearth. First, to atone for the unexpiated murder, she took a suckling pig from a sow with dukes still swollen after littering. Holding it over them, she cut its throat and let the blood fall on their hands. Next she petitioned Zeus with other libations, calling on him as the cleanser, who listens to a murderer's prayer with friendly ears. Then the attendant naiads who did her housework carried all the refuse out of doors, but she herself stayed by the hearth, burning cakes and other wineless offerings with prayers to Zeus, in the hope that she might cause the loathsome Furies to relent, and that he himself might once more smile upon this pair, whether the hands they lifted up to him were stained with a kinsman's or a stranger's blood. When all was done, she raised them up, seated them in polished chairs, and taking a seat nearby where she could watch their faces, she began by asking them to tell her what had brought them overseas, from what port they had sailed to visit her, and why they had sought asylum at her hearth. Horrible memories of her dream came back to her as she wondered what was coming, and she waited eagerly to hear a kinswoman's voice. As soon as the girl had looked up from the ground, and she noticed her eyes, for all children of the sun were easy to recognize, even from a distance, by their flashing eyes which shot out rays of golden light. Medea, daughter of Aeetes, the black-hearted king, answered all her aunt's questions, speaking quietly in the Colchian tongue. She told her of the quest and the voyage of the Argonauts, of their stern ordeal, and how she herself had been induced to sin by her unhappy sister, and had fled from her father's tyranny with Phrixus' sons. But she said nothing of the murder of Asphytus. Not that Circe was deceived. Nevertheless, she felt some pity for her weeping niece. "Poor girl," she said, "you have indeed contrived for yourself a shameful and unhappy homecoming, for which I am sure you will not long be able to escape your family's wrath. The wrongs you have done him are intolerable, and he will soon be in Hellas itself to avenge his son's murder. However, since you are my suppliant and kinswoman, I will not add to your afflictions now that you are here, but I do demand that you should leave my house, you that have linked yourself to this foreigner, whoever he may be, this man of mystery whom you have chosen without your father's consent. And do not kneel to me at my hearth, for I never will approve your conduct and disgraceful flight. Medea's grief when she heard this was more than she could bear. She drew her robe across her eyes and wailed until Jason took her by the hand and led her out of doors, shivering with fear. Thus they left Circe's house. Nothing of this escaped Hera, wife of Zeus, the son of Cronos. Eris pointed them out to her when she saw them leaving the hall. The goddess had asked her to watch for the moment when they set out for the ship, and now she urged her once again to help her. Dear Eris, if ever you have done my bidding, serve me now. Speed away on your light wings, and ask Thetis to come here to me out of the salt sea depths. I need her. After that, go to the sea coast where the bronze anvils of Hephaestus are pounded by his mighty hammers, and tell him to let his bellows sleep till Argo has passed by. Next, go to Aeolus, king of the sky-born winds, and to him to convey my wishes, which are that he should order all the winds of heaven to cease. The sea must not be ruffled by a breeze. All I ask is a soft air from the west, till the lords in Argo reach Alcinous, Phoenician isle. Eris, spreading her light pinions, swooped down from Olympus and cleft the air, plunging first into the Aegean Sea where Nereus lives. She approached Thetis, delivered the message from Hera, and urged her to go to the goddess. Then she went to Hephaestus and easily persuaded him to rest. The iron hammers ceased, the smoky bellows blew no more. Last of all she went to Aeolus, the famous son of Hippotas, and when she had given him too her message, she rested her swift limbs, the errand done. Meanwhile Thetis, leaving Nereus and her sisters in the sea, had reached Olympus and presented herself to Hera. The goddess made her take a seat behind her and disclosed her mind. Listen, Lady Thetis, she said, I was anxious to have a word with you. You know the strength of my regard for the noble son of Aeson and the others who supported him in this ordeal. Also that I brought them safely through the wandering rocks, where fiery blasts of rage roar, and the rollers break in foam on jagged reefs. But it still remains for them to pass the great cliff of Scylla and the gurgling whirlpool of Charybdis. Now you will not have forgotten that I brought you up myself and loved you more than any other lady of the sea, because you rejected the amorous advances of my consort Zeus. He, of course, has made a habit of such practices and sleeps with goddesses and girls alike. But you were frightened, and out of your regard for me, you would not let him have his will. In return for which he took a solemn oath that you should never be a bride of an immortal god. Yet in spite of your refusal, he did not cease to keep his eye on you, till the day when the venerable Themis made him understand that you were destined to bear a son who would be greater than his father. When he heard this, Zeus gave you up, though he still desired you. He wished to keep his power forever and was terrified at the thought that he might meet his match and be supplanted as the king of heaven. Then, in the hope of making you a happy bride and mother, I chose Peleus, the noblest man alive, to be your husband. I invited all the gods and goddesses to the wedding feast, and I carried the bridal torch myself in return for the goodwill and deference you had shown me. And there is something else that I must tell you, a prophecy concerning your son Achilles, who is now with Chiron the centaur, and is fed by the water nymphs, though he should be at your breast. When he comes to the Elysian fields, it has been arranged that he shall marry Medea, the daughter of Aeetes, so you, as her future mother-in-law, should be ready to help her now. Help Peleus too. Why are you still so angry with him? He was very foolish, but even the gods are sometimes visited by Ete. I have little doubt that Hephaestus and Aeolus will do what I have told them. Hephaestus will let his fires down, and Aeolus will hold his gusty winds in check, letting none but the soft zephyr blow till Argo reach the Phaeacian port. It is for you to see that they come safely. The only things I fear are the rocks and those tremendous waves. I count on you and your sisters to deal with these, and do not let my friends be so unwary as to fall to Charybdis, or at one gulp she will swallow them all. Nor let them go too far, the hateful den of the Aosan Scylla, that wicked monster born to Phorcys by night-wandering Hecate, whom men call Crateus. Or she may swoop down, take her pick, and destroy them in her terrible jaws. What you must do is to guide that ship, that they escape disaster, if only by a hair's breadth. Thetis replied, if the fury of the flames and the storm winds is indeed to be abated, I am confident. Given a fresh breeze from the west, I shall bring Argo safely through, whatever seas she may encounter. But time presses, and I have a long way to go. First to my sisters to enlist their help, and then to the place where the ship is moored, to induce them that men to sail at dawn if they wish to reach their homes. With that, Thetis dropped from the sky and plunged into the turmoil of the dark blue sea. There she called to all of her sister Nereids to help her. They heard her call, and when they had assembled, Thetis told them what Hera wished, and sent them speeding off to the Aocean Sea. She herself, quick as the twinkle of an eye, or the sun's rays when he springs from the world's rim, sped through the water to the beach of Aea on the Tyrrhenian coast. She found the young lords by their ship, passing the time with quoits and archery. Drawing near, she touched the hand of Lord Peleus, who was her husband. The rest saw nothing. She appeared to him only, and to him she said, you and your friends have sat here long enough. In the morning you must cast off the hawsers of your gallant ship in obedience to Hera. She is your friend and has arranged for the daughters of Nereus to foregather quickly and bring Argo safely through the wandering rocks, as they are called. That being the way you must follow. But when you see me coming with the rest, do not point me out to anyone. Keep my appearance to yourself, and you will make me even angrier than you did when you treated me in such brutal fashion. And with that she vanished into the depths of the sea. Her husband felt a pang of remorse. He had never set eyes on her since that night, when in a rage she had left her bridal bed. They had quarrelled about the illustrious Achilles. He was a baby then, and in the middle of night she used to surround her mortal child with fire, and every day anoint his tender flesh with ambrosia to make him immortal and save him from the horrors of old age. One night Peleus, leaping out of bed, saw his boy gasping in the flames and gave a terrible cry. It was a foolish thing to do. Thetis heard, and snatching the child threw him screaming to the floor. Then passing quickly out of the house, light as a dream and insubstantial as air, she plunged into the sea. She was mortally offended, and she never returned. Her appearance now left Peleus in a daze. Nevertheless, he passed on all her orders to his comrades. They broke off at once in the middle of their games, prepared their supper and their beds, and after eating slept through the night in their accustomed way. But when bright dawn lit up the edge of heaven, a brisk wind sprang up from the west, and they left the shore and went on board. In high spirits they weighed anchor and put all their tackle in order. Then they raised the sail, making it taut with the yardarm sheets, and the fresh breeze carried the ship on. Before long they sighted the beautiful island of Anathemosa, where the clear-voiced sirens, Archelaus' daughters, used to bewitch with their seductive melodies whatever sailors anchored there. Lovely Terescore, one of the Muses, had borne them to Archelaus, and at one time they had been handmaids of Demeter's gallant daughter before she was married, and sung to her in chorus. But now, half human and half bird in form, they spent their time watching for ships from a height that overlooked their excellent harbour, and many a traveller, reduced by them to skin and bones, has forfeited the happiness of reaching home. The sirens, hoping to add the Argonauts to these, made haste to greet them with a liquid melody. And the young men would soon have to cast their horses on the beach if Thracian Orpheus had not intervened. Raising his Bistonian lyre, he drew from it the lively tune of a fast-moving song, so as to din their ears with a melody of competing sounds. The girlish voices were defeated by the lyre, and the west wind, aided by the sounding backwash of the shore, carried the ship off. The siren's song grew indistinct, yet even so was one man, Bootes, the noble son of Teleon, who was so enchanted by their sweet voices that before he could be stopped he leapt into the sea from his polished bench. The poor man swam through the dark swell, making for the shore, and had he landed, they would soon have robbed him of all hope of reaching home. But Aphrodite, queen of Eryx, had pity on him. She snatched him up while he was still battling with the surf, and having saved his life, she took him to her heart and found a home for him on the heights of Lilybaeumum. The Argonauts sailed on in gloom. The sirens were behind him. But the worst perils lay ahead. At a place where the two seas met and shipping came to grief, on one side the sheer cliff of Scylla hove into sight, on the other Charybdis seethed and roared incessantly, while beyond great seas were booming on the wandering rocks, where but a little earlier flames from the growing lava had shot up above the crags, and a pall of smoke had hidden the sun. By now Hephaestus had ceased to work, but even so hot vapour was still rising from the sea. The Nereids, swimming from all directions, met them here, and Lady Thetis, coming up astern, laid her hand on the blade of the steering oar to guide them through the wandering rocks. While she played the steersman part, nymph after nymph kept leaping from the sea and swimming round the Argo like a school of dolphins gambolling round a moving ship in sunny weather, much to the entertainment of the crew as they see them darting up, now aft, now ahead, now abeam. But just as they were about to strike the rocks, the sea nymphs, holding their skirts up over their white knees, began to run along the top of the reefs, and breaking waves following each other at intervals on either side of the ship. Argo, caught in the current, was tossed to the right and left. Angry seas rose up all around her and crashed down on the rocks, which at once soared into the air like peaks, and at the next, striking fast at the bottom of the sea, were submerged by the raging waters. But the Nereids, passing from the ship from hand to hand and side to side, kept her scudding through the air on top of the waves. It was like the game that young girls play beside a sandy beach when they roll their skirts up to their waists on either side and toss a ball round to one another, throwing it high into the air so that it never touches the ground. Thus, through the water, swirling and seething around them, these sea nymphs kept Argo from the rocks. They were watched by the Lord Hephaestus himself, standing on the summit of the smooth rock and resting his great shoulder on the haft of his hammer. Hera, wife of Zeus, watched them too, taking her stand above the sunny sky, and in her terror at the sight she threw her arms around Athene. The Nereids worked hard to heave Argo clear of the resounding rocks, and it took them as long a time as daylight lingers in the evening of spring. But catching the wind at last, Argo ran ahead, and they were soon passing Thrinace and the meadows where the cattle of the sun are kept. Here the nymphs dived like sea mews into the depths, having carried out the orders of the wife of Zeus. The Argonauts were close inshore, and through the mist the bleating of sheep and lowing of cattle came to their ears. Thraethutha, the youngest daughter of Helios, was grazing the sheep in the dewy glades, with the silver crook in her hand, while Lympete looked after the cows and walked behind, swinging a staff of shining copper. They could see these cows feeding in the low ground and the water meadow by the river. Not one of them was dark, they were all milk white and rejoiced in golden horns. When the Argonauts passed them, it was still daylight. By nightfall they were well out to open sea. All was well, and in her own good time dawn came once more to light them on their way. In the Ceryneian Sea, fronting the Ionian Straits, there is a rich and spacious island, under the soil of which it is said to lie. Bear with me, muses, it gives me little pleasure to recall the old tale. The sickle used by Cronos to castrate his father Uranus. Others call it a reaping hook of Demeter of the underworld, who lived there once and taught the Titans to reap corn for food. In her affection for Macris, from this reaping hook, the island takes its name, Drepane, the sacred nurse of the Phaeacians, who, by the same token, traced their origin to Uranus. From the seas of Sicily, Argo, with her load of trouble, was wafted across to this Phaeacian isle. King Alcinous and his people received their visitors with open arms. Thank offerings were made to the gods, and the whole town feted them. They might have been welcoming to their own sons. As for the Argonauts, they mingled freely with the crowds and could not have felt happier if they had found themselves in the heart of their own land. Yet they were soon to arm for battle. A large force of Colchians had appeared in the offing. This was the party that had passed out of the Black Sea through the Chinean rocks in pursuit of Argo. They now made insistent demands for the return of Medea to her father's house without parley, failing which they threatened savage reprisals on their own part at once, and more from Aeetes when he came. But set on fighting though they were, King Alcinous restrained them. It was his aim to bring the feud to an end without recourse to arms. The prospect terrified Medea. She appealed to Jason's friends repeatedly and to Alcinous' wife Arete, touching her knees with her hands. "My queen," she said, "be gracious to your suppliant, and do not let the Colchians take me back to my father. You too are a woman, and must know how easily a venal misdeed can lead us to ruin. Such was my case, my wits forsook me, but I was not a wanton, and I swear by the sun's sacred light and by the sacred rites of Perseus, night-wandering daughter, that I never intended to run away from home with a set of foreigners. No, I had done wrong, and it was fear of the consequences that turned my thoughts to flight. I had no other motive. Also, no one has touched me. I am still a virgin, that I was when at home. My lady, pity me, soften your husband's heart, and may the gods grant you honour, children, and a perfect life in a glorious city, free from the ravages of war." Such was her tearful appeal to Arete. In approaching the Argonauts, she used other pleas, saying to each of them in turn, "You, my most illustrious lords, you and the help I gave you in your troubles are the sole cause of my affliction. Through me the bulls were yoked, and the deadly harvest of earth-born men was reaped. Through me you are homeward bound with your golden fleece on board. So here I am, who have lost my country and my parents and forfeited my home and all the joys of life, giving back your country and your homes to you. You can look forward to the joy of seeing your parents again. For me, no happiness remains, thanks to an unkind God. I am a thing despised, a wanderer in the hands of foreigners. Respect your covenants and oaths, fear the suppliant's fury, fear heaven's vengeance, if I fall into my father's hands and am foully done to death. I seek asylum in no temple of the gods, no fort, no other sanctuary. I look to you and you alone, and all I find in hearts of flint. Are you not put to shame when you see me in my desperation kneeling to a foreign queen? You were ready enough when you wanted the fleece to face all of Colchis up in arms and the haughty king himself. Where is your bravery now, when the Colchians are cut off from their country and their king? Each of the men to whom she thus appealed did his utmost to allay her fears and hearten her. They brandished their sharp spears, unsheathed their swords, and promised to stand by her to end if justice were not done. In the midst of these alarms, night with her gentle ban on man's activities descended on the company. She put the world to sleep, but not Medea. For her there was no rest. Her heart was wrung with pain, and she let the tears run down her cheeks like a patient working woman turning her spindle in the night. And as she hears her orphan children cry, dropping a tear for her lost man, and her own hard lot. In their palace in the town, King Alcinous and Arete, his admirable queen, had retired as usual to bed. As they lay there in the dark, they discussed Medea's future, and Arete, as became his wife, spoke to the king out of the fullness of her heart. "My dear," she said, "I beg you for my sake to side with the Minyae, and save this unhappy girl from the Colchians. Argos is close to our island, and the Haemonians are our neighbours, whereas Aeetes lives far away, and we do not even know him, we only know his name. She is a woman who has suffered much. She came to me with her troubles, and she broke my heart. My lord, do not let the Colchians take her back to her father. She was out of her mind when she gave that man the magic charm for the bulls. Then, as we sinners often do, she tried to cover one fault with another by running away from her domineering father and his wrath. But I hear that Jason has given her his solemn oath that he will take her into his home as his wedded wife. That being so, my love, let no decision of your own cause Aeson's son to break his promise. Nor, if you can help it, let the girl's angry father do her some frightful mischief. Fathers are much too jealous where their daughters are concerned. Remember how Nyctaeus treated the lovely Antiope. Think of Danae, too, what she suffered on the high seas through her father's cruelty. Why, only recently, and not so far from us, the brutal Achatus drove brazen spikes into his daughter's eyes, and now the miserable girl is wasting away in a gloomy cell, grinding grains of bronze. Alcinous was touched by his wife's prayers. "Arete," he said, "I could certainly repel the Colchians by force of arms, siding with the young lords for Medea's sake. But I should think twice before defying the just sentence from Zeus, nor would it be wise to make little Aeetes, as you would have me do. There is no greater king, and far away as he is, he would bring war to Hellas if he wished. No, it is my duty to give a decision, and the whole world will acknowledge as the best. I will tell you what I mean to do. If Medea is still a virgin, I shall direct them to take her back to her father. If she is a married woman, I will not separate her from her husband, nor will I give a child of hers to the enemy if she has conceived." So said Alcinous, and fell asleep at once. But Arete, taking to heart the wisdom of his words, rose from the bed immediately and went through the house. Her waiting women all came up and fussed around their mistress, but she quietly beckoned to her herald and bade him convey her own shrewd counsel to the son of Aeson. He was to marry Medea, and not to plead with Alcinous, as the king was going to tell the Colchians himself that he would restore Medea to her father if she was still a virgin, but would not separate the loving pair if she were a married woman. Thus instructed, the herald sped from the palace to convey Arete's opportune advice to Jason and tell him what the good king meant to do. He found the Argonauts keeping armed watch beside their ship in the harbour of Hylas near the town. He gave them his message in full. They were all delighted. It was happy news indeed that he had brought them. They at once set about the customary rites. They mixed a bowl of wine for the blessed gods, led sheep to the altar with due ritual, and for that every rite prepared a bridal bed for Medea in the sacred grove where Macris once lived. Macris was the daughter of Aristaeus, the honey-loving. shepherd who discovered the secret of the bees and the riches that the olive yields in payment for our toil. It was Macris who, in Abantaean Euboea, took the infant Dionysus to her bosom and moistened his parched lips with honey. When Hermes has rescued him from the flames and brought him to her. But Hera saw this and in her anger banished her from Euboea. So Macris came to the remote Thessaean land, where she lived in the sacred cave and brought abundance to the people. It was here then that they prepared a great bed, spreading the shining golden fleece on top of it to grace the wedding and make it famous in story. Nymphs gathered flowers for them, and as they brought the many-coloured bunches into the cave, in their white arms and fiery splendour, the fleece played and shone on all. So bright was the glitter of its golden wool, it kindled in their eyes a sweet desire. They longed to lay their hands on it, yet they were afraid to touch it. Some of these nymphs were daughters of the river Aegeus. Others lived on the heights of the Miletan Mount. Others again were woodland spirits from the plains. All were sent to the wedding by Hera, wife of Zeus, who thus did honour Jason. As for his bride, the place where the pair were brought together, when the fragrant linen had been spread, is still called the sacred cave of Medea. The Argonauts, lest the Colchian foe should take them by surprise, picked up their battle spears. Then their temples wreathed with leafy twigs. They sang the hymeneal song in unison outside the bridal chamber to the clear notes of Orpheus' lyre, and so the pair were married in Alcinous' domain. Not that the Lord Jason willed it so, he had meant their wedding to take place in his father's house when he returned to Iolcus, and so had Medea. It was necessity that made them marry now. And since we men can never rest from care and tread securely in the path of happiness without some bitter thought for company, these two, though they loved and delighted in each other, were haunted by fear that Alcanius' verdict might not be upheld. Dawn's celestial beams chased black night from the sky. The island beaches and the dewy paths across the distant fields laughed in the light. The streets were filled with noise, and the whole town began to stir. On the far side of the island of Macris, the Colchians also were afoot, and Alcinous went to them now, as he had promised to give them his decision in Medea's case. He carried in his hand the judge's golden staff, equipped with which he meted out impartial justice to the people of the town. With him the company after company of Thracian nobles marched in procession fully armed. Crowds of women poured out from the city to see the lordly Argonauts, and countrymen flocked in to meet them when they heard the news, which had passed from mouth to mouth, sponsored by Hera. One man led in his best ram of his flock, another brought a heifer that had never toiled. Others set down two-handled jars of wine ready for the mixing bowls, and far and wide the smoke of burnt offerings rose into the air. The women brought their own appropriate gift, embroidered robes, golden trinkets, and all the other finery that goes to deck a bride. They saw the famous Argonauts and marvelled at their comeliness. They saw Orpheus in among them, beating the ground with his gleaming sandal to the time of his song of his ringing lyre. When he sang of the wedding, all the nymphs joined in the lovely marriage song, and then again, as they circled in the dance, they sang alone, tendering their thanks to Hera, who had put it in Arete's mind to reveal the wise decision of the king. From that moment when he delivered judgment and it was known that the pair were now man and wealth, Alcinous remained inflexible. He was shaken by no deadly fears, no dread of Aeetes' enmity. He had taken oaths that were not to be broken, and he would not break them. So when the Colchians perceived that their protestations were in vain, and were told that if they did not accept his ruling, he would close his harbours to their ships, they recalled their own king's threats and besought Alcinous to receive them as friends. And there on the island they lived for a long time with the Phaeacians. Later on, Bacchiaide, whose native place was Ephyra, settled there too, and the Colchians crossed to an island opposite, only to leave it at a later date and pass over to the Cyrenian mountains where the Abantus lived, to join the Nestaeans, and so reach Oricum. But all this was the work of ages, and still the altars which Medea built on the island at the shrine of the shepherd Apollo are laden year by year with offerings to the Fates and the nymphs. When the Argonauts left, Alcinous gave them many parting gifts, and so did Arete, who also presented Medea with 12 Phaeacian maids from the palace to attend her. They sailed from Drepane on the 7th day with a fresh breeze that Zeus had sent at dawn. The Argo sped before the wind, but they were not destined yet to set foot in Achaea. Before that could be, fresh trials awaited them in the confines of Libya. The Ambracian coast, Gulf, the land of Curates, the narrow islands that include Echinades, all these they passed in turn with their canvas spread, and they had just sighted the land of Pelops when they were caught by a northerly gale which swept them up south for 9 days and nights over the Libyan Sea, and drove them deep into Syrtis. This is a gulf from which no shipping can escape. Once it has been carried in, there are shoals everywhere, with tangled masses and seaweed from the depths, over which a spindthrift blows. And beyond, sand stretching to the dim horizon, no living creature on the ground or in the air. The tides often run high, retreating from the coast, only to come racing back and roar across the outer beach. It was one of these flood tides that caught Argo and incontinently swept her up to the inner shore, leaving her there with her keel for the most part high and dry. The crew leapt down and were dismayed by what they saw: mist, and a landscape insubstantial as the mist itself, stretching away unbroken and immense. They could descry no watering place, no path, no distant farmstead. Silence reigned over a lifeless world. In their misery they asked one another on what unknown shore the gale had thrown them up. They wished that they had cast all fear away and dared to sail once more through the clashing rocks, even against the will of Zeus. They might have perished, but they would have at least aimed at glory. As it was, how could they survive even for a few days here where the winds had boxed them in? They looked with horror at the desert spreading out before them from the margin of an empty continent. Their helmsman Anchias himself, unmanned by the disaster, could not conceal his grief. This is indeed a catastrophe, he said, and there is no way out. We are bound to suffer frightful hardships here in this desolate spot, even if we get an offshore wind. I have looked all around, and as far as I can see, there are shoals everywhere, with great breakers rolling in over the white sand. Our good ship here would have been smashed to pieces long before she reached the land if a flood tide had not floated her in from the deep sea. But now the tide is ebbing, and there is nothing left but light surf, scarcely deep enough to cover the ground. No ship could ride in it. And so, if you ask me, we might as well give up all hope for sailing home. Let someone else who feels the urge to get us out sit down at the helm and show what he can do, for I myself do not believe that Zeus designs to end our sufferings with the sight of home. And Caius wept, and those who knew anything of navigation joined in his despair. The hearts of all were chilled, their cheeks grew pale, and they began to stray, dragging their feet along the endless beach. So in some doomed city, when the gods' statues are sweating blood and bellowing is heard in the temples, or the midday sun has been eclipsed by stars that shine out in a darkened sky, men wander ghost-like in the streets, expecting war or pestilence, or the flooding of their fields by torrential rain. When night approached, they tearfully embraced one another, took loving leave and separated, each seeking a spot where he could fall on the sand and die alone. By spreading out and passing one another, all were able to find places for themselves, and once there they wrapped their heads in their cloaks and lay without food or drink, all night and into the day, waiting for a miserable death. Elsewhere Medea's maids had gathered around their mistress. They laid their golden tresses in the dust, and all night long made piteous lament, shrill as the twittering of unfledged birds fallen from a cleft in the rock, and crying for their mother, and sad as the music that is echoed by dewy meadows and the river's lovely stream when swans begin to sing on the banks of Patlochus. And now it seemed that all these gallant men would die there, with their task unfinished, passing from life unnoticed and unsung by humankind. But as they wasted there in misery, they were observed with pity by the high-born nymphs that guard the Libyan shore. These were the nymphs who found Athene when she issued in her gleaming panoply from her father's head and bathed her in the water of Trito. Now at high noon, when Libya lay scorched under the burning sun, they came to Jason and gently removed the cloak from his head. Jason looked up, but in awe of their divinity he turned his eyes aside. Then the nymphs, seeing that he was alone, spoke out and reproved him in friendly tones for lying there in such abandonment. "Why this despair?" they said. "Are you not the men who fetched the golden fleece? We know how you have roamed the world. We know of each heroic deed that you have done, on land or sea. For we who speak to you as mortals do are goddesses, the high-born solitary spirits of this land, wardens and daughters of Libya. Up then, banish your own despondency and rouse your men, remembering this. When Amphitrite has unyoked the horses from Poseidon's rolling chariot, you must repay your mother for what she suffered all the long time she bore you in the womb. Thus you may yet return to your sacred land of Achaea." They spoke, and the next moment their place was empty. They were neither to be seen nor heard. Jason looked around him and sat up. "Glorious spirits of the wilderness," he cried, "be gracious to me. I do not fully understand your prophecy of our return, but I will assemble all my friends and tell them, in hope that we may find the clue and so be saved. Many heads are wiser than one." With that he leapt up and shouted to his men, standing there with the dust on them like a tawny lion calling across the jungle for his mate, with a great roar that terrifies cattle and their herdsmen in the fields and shakes the wooded glens of mountains far away. But to them there was no menace in his voice. They heard a comrade calling to his friends, and they came trooping in with downcast looks. Jason made them sit down by the ship, together with the women, and told them everything. "Listen, my friends, I have been visited in my distress by 3 goddesses. They wore goatskin capes reaching from neck to waist. They looked to me like young girls. Standing over me, they removed the mantle from my head with gentle hands and told me to get up and rouse you also. They said that when Amphitrite had unyoked the horses from Poseidon's rolling chariot, we were to recompense our mother amply for what she had suffered all the long time she bore us in her womb. Now I admit that the meaning of this oracle eludes me. At the same time they told me they were divine spirits, wardens and daughters of Libya, and they professed to know all about us and our adventures on sea and land. Then in a moment they were no more. A kind of mist or cloud had come between us." The Minier listened with amazement to his tale. It was followed by the most astounding prodigy. A great horse came bounding out of the sea, a monstrous animal, with his golden mane waving in the air. He shook himself, tossing off the spray in showers. Then, fast as the wind, he galloped away. Peleus was overjoyed, and at once explained the portent to the others. "It is clear to me," he said, "that Poseidon's loving wife has just unyoked his team. As for our mother, I take her to be none but the ship herself. Argo carried us in her womb. We have often heard her groaning in pain. Now we will carry her. We will hoist her on our shoulders, and never resting, never tiring, carry her across the sandy waste in the track of the galloping horse. He will not disappear inland. I am sure that his hoofprints will lead us to some bay that overlooks the sea," Peleus finished, and they all felt that he could not have interpreted this portent better. "I am the mouthpiece of the Muses. What follows us is their tale, and a voice from heaven, a voice that cannot lie, tells me that these, the noblest of all sons of kings, by their own might and hardihood carried their ship and all it held, shoulder high, 9 days and nights across desert dunes of Libya. But who can tell the pain and misery that the work entailed? They surely were scions of the gods to take on such a task. True, they had no choice, and yet they carried her all the long way, as cheerfully as when they waded in with her and set her down from their sturdy shoulders in the Tritoneal Goon. Once there, it was their first concern to slack the burning thirst that was added to their other aches and pains. They dashed off like mad dogs in search of fresh water, and they were fortunate. They found the sacred plot where till the day before the serpent Ladon, a son of the Libyan soil, had kept watch over the golden apples in the garden of Atlas. While close at hand and busy at their tasks, the Hesperides sang their lovely song. But now the snake, struck down by Heracles, lay by the trunk of the apple tree. Only the tip of his tail was still twitching. From the head down, his dark spine showed not a sign of life. His blood had been poisoned by arrows steeped in the gall of the Lyrian hydra, and flies perished in the festering wounds. Close by, with their white arms flung over their golden heads, the Hesperides were wailing as the Argonauts approached. The whole company came on them suddenly, and in a trice the nymphs turned to dust and earth on the spot where they stood. Orpheus, seeing the hand of heaven in this, addressed a prayer to them on behalf of his comrades. Beautiful and beatific powers, queens indeed, be kind to us, whether Olympus or the underworld count you among its goddesses, or whether you prefer the name of solitary nymphs. Come, blessed spirits, daughters of Ocean, make yourselves manifest to our expectant eyes, and lead us to a place where we can quench this burning, never-ending thirst with fresh water springing from a rock or gushing from the ground. And if we bring home our ship into the Achaean port, we will treat you as we treat the greatest goddesses, showing our gratitude with innumerable gifts of wine and offerings at the festal board. Orpheus sobbed as he prayed, but the nymphs were still at hand, and they took pity on the suffering of men. They wrought a miracle. First grass sprang up from the ground, then long shoots appeared above the grass, and in a moment 3 saplings, tall, straight, and in full leaf, were growing there. Hesperi became a poplar, Euryanthes an elm, and Aegle a sacred willow. Yet they were still themselves. The trees could not conceal their former shapes. That was the greatest wonder of all. And now the Argonauts heard Aegle in her gentle voice tell them what they wished to know. You have indeed been fortunate, she said. There was a man here yesterday, an evil man, who killed the watching snake, stole our golden apples, and is gone. To us he brought unspeakable sorrow, to you release from suffering. He was a savage brute, hideous to look at, a cruel man with glaring eyes and scowling face. He wore the untanned skin of an enormous lion, and carried a great club of olive wood, and a bow and arrows with which he shot our monster here. It appeared that he, like you, had come on foot and was parched with thirst, for he rushed about this place in search of water, but with no success, till he found the rock that you see over there near the Tritonian lagoon. Then it occurred to him, or he was prompted by a god, to tap the base of the rock. He struck it with his foot. Water gushed out, and he fell on his hands and chest and drank greedily from the cleft, till, with his head down like a beast in the fields, he had filled his mighty paunch. The Minyae were delighted. They ran off in happy haste towards the place where Aegle had pointed out the spring, and once there the whole crowd milled around the cranny in rock, like a swarm of burrowing ants busy round a little hole, or flies alighting by a drop of honey and struggling fiercely with one another for access to the delicious stuff. Refreshed at last, with water dripping from their lips, they began to talk of Heracles and the strange chance that had enabled him, though far away, to save his friends when they were parched with thirst. And when someone suggested that a party should set out in the hope of finding him as he trudged across the mainland sands, those who were specially fitted for the task responded. But they did not go together, as the night wind had effaced the tracks with shifting sand. They began their search in different directions. The two sons of the north wind rallied on their wings, Euphemus on his nimble feet, Lycaeus on his long sight, while Canthus, the fifth man to join the quest, was impelled to go, not only by the hand of fate, but by his own chivalry. He wished to learn from Heracles where he had left Polyphemus' son Elates, a friend of his. He was anxious to have the whole story, but he never heard it. Polyphemus, after founding a splendid city in Mysia, had become homesick and tramped through the Asian mainland in search of Argo. He reached the country of Cebelus, who lived near the coast, and there he met his doom. He is commemorated by a monument that stands under a tall poplar close to the sea. As for Heracles, Lycaeus thought he saw a lonely figure on the verge of this vast land. As a man, when a mouth begins, sees or thinks he sees the new moon through the clouds, he went back and told his comrades that there was now no chance of overtaking Heracles. Euphemus of the swift feet and the two sons of the Thracian Boreas also returned. They too had failed. But alas for Canthus, struck down in Libya by the hand of death. He had found a grazing flock and was driving them off for his famished comrades when the shepherd who followed them came up to defend his property, threw a stone at him and killed him. Caphaerus, the man who did this, was no weakling, but a grandson of Phoebus and the virtuous lady Acacalis, whom her own father Minos banished to Libya, when she was carrying the god's offspring in her womb. In due course the noble child was born. They call him Amphimius or Garamas. He married a Tritonian nymph, and she gave him two sons, Nasamon and the powerful Caphaerus, who, as we have seen, killed Canthus in defence of his sheep. But he did not escape the avenging hands of the Minyae. When they heard of the outrage, they dealt with him, found Canthus' body and brought it back to their camp, where they bewailed and buried him. They also took the sheep. On the very same day, Mopsus, son of Amphicus, met a cruel fate. He was a prophet, but that did not save him from final bitterness, for no one can turn death aside. A fearsome snake lay in the sand, sheltering from the midday sun. It was too sluggish to attack a man who showed no wish to harm it, or to fly at anyone who shrank away. And yet for any creature living on the face of Mother Earth, one drop of his black poison in his veins was a shortcut to the world below. Paeon himself, if I may tell the truth without offence, could not have saved the victim's life, even if the fangs had only grazed the skin. For when the godlike Perseus, whom his mother called Eurymedon, flew over Libya, bringing the Gorgon's newly severed head to the king, every drop of dark blood that fell from it to the ground produced a brood of these serpents. Mopsus, stepping forward with his left foot, brought the soul down the tip of the creature's tail, and in its pain the snake coiled around his shin and calf and bit him halfway up the leg, tearing the flesh. Medea and her women servants shrank back in horror, but Mopsus bravely put his hand on the bleeding wound, for the pain was not immense, yet the poor man was doomed. A paralyzing numbness was already creeping through him, and a dark mist began to dim his sight. Unable to control his heavy limbs, he sank to the ground and was soon cold. Jason and his friends gathered round him, dumbfounded by the sudden tragedy. Mopsus was dead, and they could not leave him in the sunshine even for a short time, for the poison at once began to rot his flesh, and mouldering hair fell from his scalp. So they set to work with bronze mattocks and quickly dug him a grave. In their sorrow for the pitiable dead, the women and the men alike tore their hair. They gave him solemn burial, marched in full armour 3 times around the grave, and raised a mound above it. A south wind blew across the sea, and they embarked, meaning to find a way out of the Tritonian lagoon. But as they had no definite aim, they drifted helplessly the whole day long. Argo's course, as she kept nosing round for a navigable outlet, was as tortuous as the path of the snake wriggling along in search of shelter from the scorching sun, and peering about him with an angry hiss and scintillating eyes, till he slipped into his lair through a cleft in the rock. In the end, Orpheus suggested that they should bring out the great tripod that Apollo had given Jason and offer it to the gods of the land, who might thus be induced to help them on their way. So they went ashore, and no sooner had they set up the tripod than a great god Triton appeared before them, taking the form of a young man. He picked up a clod of earth and held it out to them by way of welcome, saying, "Accept these gifts, my friend, here and now. I have no better one with which to welcome strangers such as you. But if you have lost your bearings like many a traveller in foreign parts, and wish to cross the Libyan Sea, I will be your guide. My father Poseidon has taught me all its secrets, and I am the king of this seaboard. You may have heard of me, though you live so far away, Eurypylus, born in Libya, the country of wild beasts." Euphemus gladly held his hand out for the clod and said, "My lord, if you know anything of the Minoan Sea and the Peloponnesus, we beg you to tell us. Far from meaning to come here, we were driven ashore on the borders of your land by a heavy gale. Then we hoisted our ship, and for all her weight carried her across the country until we came to this lagoon. And now we have no idea how to get out of it and reach the land of the Pelops." Triton, stretching out his hand, pointed to the distant sea and the deep mouth of the lagoon. At the same time he explained, "That is the outlet to the sea. The smooth dark water marks the deepest spot, but on either side of it are beaches where the rollers break. You can see the foam from here, and the fairway in between them is a narrow one. The misty sea beyond it stretches from here to the sacred land of Pelops, on the other side of Crete. Once you are out in the open, keep the land on your right and hug the coast as long as it runs north. But when it trends towards you and then falls away, you may safely leave it at that point where it projects and sail straight on. A happy voyage then, and if the work is heavy, do not let that distress you. Young limbs should not object to toil. Thus, encouraged by the friendly god, the Argonauts embarked at once. They were determined to escape from the lagoon by rowing, and the ship forged ahead under their eager hands. Meanwhile, Triton picked up the heavy tripod and walked into the water. They saw him stepping in, yet in a moment he had disappeared quite close to them, tripod and all. But their hearts were warmed. They felt that one of the blessed ones had come to them and brought them good luck. They urged Jason to kill the best of their sheep and hold it out to the gods with words of praise. Jason hastily selected one, lifted it up, and killed it over the stern, praying in these words: God of the sea, you that appeared to us on the shore of these waters, whether the ladies of the brine know you as that sea wonder Triton, or as Phorcys, or as Nereus, be gracious and grant us the happy return we desire. As he prayed, he slit the victim's throat and threw it into the water from the stern, whereupon the god emerged from the depths, no longer in disguise, but in his own true form, and grasping the stem of their hollow ship, drew her on towards the open sea. So does a man trot along beside a fast horse, gripping his bushy mane, as he brings him into the race and the great arena. And nothing loath the horse goes with him, tossing up his head in pride and making a foam-flecked bit ring out of the champs from its jaws to this side and that. The body of the god, front and back, from the crown of its head to its waist and belly, was exactly like that of the other immortals, but from the hips down he was a monster of the deep, with two long tails, each ending in a pair of curved flukes, shaped like the crescent moon. With the spines of these two tails he lashed the surface of the water, and so brought Argo to the open sea, where he launched her on his way. Then he sank into the abyss, and the Argonauts cried out in wonder at the awe-inspiring sight. They spent that day on the shore. The harbour there bears Argo's name, and there are signs of her stay, including altars to Poseidon and Triton. At dawn they spread the sail and ran before the west wind, always keeping the desert to their right. The next morning they sighted the headland, and at the same time could see the corner of the sea that lay beyond the jutting cape. Here the west wind dropped, and a breeze sprang up from the south, driving white clouds before it. They rejoiced to hear it whistle in the rigging, but when the sun sank and the evening star appeared, the star that tells the shepherd to bring in his sheep, and the weary ploughman to plough no more, the wind failed them. In the darkness of night they furled the sail, lowered the tall mast, and sat down to their polished pinewood oars. They rowed hard for the rest of that night, all through the day and through the night that followed it, and they were still far from land when the high rocks of the Carpathus saluted them. From that point they were to cross Crete, the greatest island in the sea. But when they sought shelter in the haven of Dicte, they were prevented from making fast to the shore by Talos, a bronze giant who broke off lumps of rock from the cliff to hurl at them. a descendant of the brazen race that sprang from ash trees, he had survived the days of the demigods, and Zeus had given him to Europa to keep watch over Crete, by running around the island on his bronze feet 3 times a day. His body and his limbs were brazen and invulnerable, except at one point. Under a sinew by his ankle was a blood-red vein protected only by a thin skin, which to him meant life or death. He terrified the Argonauts, and exhausted though they were, they hastily backed water. Indeed, what with thirst and other pains, they would have been driven away from Crete, in a sorry frame of mind, but for Medea, who stopped them as they turned the ship about. "Listen to me," she said. "I think that I alone can get the better of that man, whoever he may be, unless there is immortal life in that bronze body. All I ask of you is to stay here, keeping the ship out of the range of his rocks till I have brought him down." They took the ship out of range, as Medea had asked, and resting on their oars, waiting to see what marvellous device she would employ, Medea went up on the deck. She covered both her cheeks with a fold of her purple mantle, and Jason led her by the hand as they passed across the benches. Then, with incantations, she invoked the spirits of death, the swift hounds of Hades, who feed on the souls and haunt the lower air to pounce on living men. She sank to her knees and called upon them 3 times in song, 3 times with spoken prayers. She steeled herself with their malignity and bewitched the eyes of Talos with the evil in her own. She flung at him the full force of her malevolence, and in ecstasy of rage she plied him with the images of death. It is true, then, Father Zeus, that people are not killed only by disease or wounds, but can be struck down by a distant enemy. The thought appalls me, yet it was thus that Talos, for all his brazen frame, was brought down by the force of Medea's magic. He was hoisting up the heavy stones with which to keep them from the anchorage, when he grazed his ankle on the sharp rock, and the ichor ran out from his molten lead. He stood there for a short time, high on the jutting cliff, but even his strong legs could not support him long, as the ichor leaked out and he began to sway. All power went out of him, and he came down with a resounding crash. Thus a tall pine up in the hills is left half felled by the woodman's sharp axe when he goes home from the woods, but in the night is shaken by the wind, till at last it snaps off at the stump and crashes down. That night they spent on the shore of Crete, but in the first light of dawn they built a shrine for Minoan Athene. Then, after drawing water, they embarked and sat down to the oars, meaning to start rounding Cape Salmoneum. The next night caught them well out in the wide Cretan sea, and they were frightened, for they had run into that sort of night that people call the Pall of Doom. No star, no moonlight pierced the funeral dark. Black chaos had descended on them from the sky, or had this darkness risen from the abyss? They could not tell whether they were drifting through Hades or still on the water. All they could do was commit their course to the sea, with no idea where it would take them. But Jason lifted his hand to Phoebus, and in a loud voice called him to save them, weeping as he prayed. He promised the god innumerable offerings, gift in Pytho, gifts in Amyclae, gifts in Ortygia. And Leto's son was quick to hear him. He came down swiftly from Olympus to the Melatian rocks which lie in the sea there, and alighting on one of them, he held up his golden bow in his right hand. The bow shot beams of dazzling light into the sky all around, and now they could see an islet, one of the Sporades, opposite the small island of Hypurus. They anchored there. Dawn came soon after and showed them the low island on which they had landed. They called it Anaphe, or Revelation, because Apollo had revealed it to them when they were benighted. In the shelter of some trees they constructed ground and built him an altar in the shade, calling him the Lord of Light, whose beacon fire had lit them from afar. On that lonely coast they had little to offer him, but they offered what they could, with the result that when Medea's Phaeacian maids, who were accustomed to the rich sacrifices made in Alcinous' palace, saw them using water for libations on the burning logs, they could no longer refrain from laughing. The men, seeing the joke themselves, retaliated with some ribaldry, which was a signal for a light-hearted exchange of insult and repartee. This frolic of the Argonauts is commemorated by the island women who chaff the men whenever they are sacrificing to Apollo, Lord of Light and protector of the Isle of Revelation. As the next morning was fair, they cast their horses off and sailed. Euphemius then remembered that he had had a dream in the night, and in deference to Hermes, god of dreams, he took pains to recall it. He had dreamt that he was holding to his breast the lump of earth which the god had given him, and was suckling it with streams of white milk. The clod, small as it was, turned into a woman of virginal appearance, and in an access of passion he lay with her. When the deed was done, he felt remorse. She had been a virgin, and he had suckled her himself. But she consoled him, saying in a gentle voice, "My friend, I am of Triton's stock, the nurse of your children, no mortal maid, but a daughter of Triton and Libya. Give me a home with Nereus' daughters in the sea near Anaphe, and I will reappear in the light of day in time to welcome your descendants." Euphemus, after committing his dream to memory, told it to Jason. The dream reminded Jason of an oracle of Apollo's, and putting the two things together, he made a prophecy himself, exclaiming, "My noble friend, you are marked out for great renown. When you have thrown this clod of earth into the sea, the gods will make an island of it, and there your children's children are to live. Triton received you as a friend with this little piece of Libyan soil. It was Triton and no other god that met us and gave you this." Euphemus heard Jason's prophecy with joy and did not make it void. He threw the clod into the depths of the sea, and there grew up an island called Calliste, the sacred nurse of his descendants. These lived at first in Sintaean Lemnos, till they were driven out by the Tyrrhenians, and found a new home in Sparta. Later they left Sparta and settled in Calliste, under the leadership of Ortysian's son, the noble Theras, who named the island Thera, later Santorini, after himself. But long before this happened, Euphemus' days were over. Sailing swiftly on, they left the great stretches of the rolling sea behind them and put into Aegina. There they were short of water, but wished to waste no time, as the wind still held. So they turned the business of watering into game, racing one another to the spring and back again with water to the ship. And to this day the young myrmidons of Aegina, carrying big jars of full water on their shoulders, race one another on track with nimble feet. Farewell, heroic men. Your blessing upon this lay of mine, and as the years go by, many people find it a sweeter and yet sweeter song to sing. Farewell, for I have come to the glorious finish of your labours. After Aegina you suffered no mishap, no gale opposed your voyage home. The coast of Attica slipped quietly by, and you sailed at ease inside Euboea, past Aeolis, past the cities of Optunian Locris, and with joyful hearts you stepped ashore at Pegasae. Here ends Book 4 of the Argo by Apollonius of Rhodes. This book was published in 1944 to 64, and this edition was published in 1959 by Penguin.